It's the physics behind, for example,
another
the reactions,
people
the
say
reaction, the actual change in
under
mass.
the ultimate question is to evaluate profits.
Over the course of 7 years,
Ethics
the book was put together.
Welcome to the Scholars Chair. I'm Jamiah Adams. Tonight, a conversation with Muslim intellectual Dr. Imad ad-Din Ahmad. He is a Palestinian-American who holds a BA cum laude from Harvard University and a PhD in astrophysics from the University of Arizona. He's president of the Minaret of Freedom Institute, an Islamic think tank located in Maryland. He's taught at the University of Maryland Johns Hopkins School for International Studies, Georgetown University, and currently at the Wesley Theological Seminary, and serves as the Muslim chaplain at American University. Author and co-author of many books, the most recent is The Islamic Rules of Order. Tonight's discussion will focus on the conflict within the Islamic civilization, the challenge of disentangling culture from religion. Written by Dr. Ahmed, right here in the Scholars Chair.
Conditions of inequality that we suffered under, when we are the oppressor, the dominant class, let's not impose that injustice on the others.
Anybody think that you could have a just system without giving women their rights?
Everyone has an opinion, and we sit around the marketplace and talk about opinion, but what is true?
With the shareholder, their goal is similar to the business, to maximize profit.
That belief becomes a context for a development of knowledge.
Say physics is the DNA of technology because the rules for how you build new technology starts in physics.
Because Quran challenges the people. It's not only the people of the book, it challenges Muslims.
We say secular, they hear godless.
Right.
What was intended?
Watch the Scholars Chair every Monday night. And here is your host.
Good evening. Good evening, Dr. Ahmed.
Good evening.
So your article published in the Global Dialogue was Conflict Within Islamic Civilization, the Challenge of Disentangling Culture from Religion. Why do you make that distinction?
Well, first off, one has to admit that culture and religion are heavily intertwined. A religion influences the culture in which it exists, and the culture will affect the religion. But I think that analytically, it's essential to be able to distinguish between what is at the core of religious teachings and what are accretions that have developed within a culture. If one looks at how Islam is practiced around the world, as you go in different societies, you'll see different foods, different modes of dress. The fundamental teachings are always the same. But even, for example, within Saudi Arabia, where there is a state-enforced interpretation of the religion, the way, for example, women will dress will vary from one part of the country to another in quite significant ways. So the problem often is many Muslims who are not very knowledgeable in the history or even the religious teachings, or even are not familiar with the Quran in a sense other than as a means of recitation for religious ritual, but without looking at its meaning, don't understand that there are core religious teachings and values in Islam, and that there are accretions having to do with culture that sometimes in their minds get confused for religious teachings, even when sometimes those cultural practices may actually be opposed or even forbidden by the Quran.
And is that dangerous? Is that dangerous to conflate the two?
It can be very dangerous. I think the most obvious example of a disaster from such conflation is in those parts of the Muslim world where female genital mutilation is practiced. If you talk to the people in that, in Upper Egypt or in Ethiopia or in Somalia, where the practice, where that is practiced, and you ask them, why do you do this? They will say, it is our religion. But in fact, if you ask almost any religious scholar, no matter where they exist in Islam, is this part of the Muslim religion, they will say it is not. And furthermore, if pressed, they will say that in fact most forms of FGM are actually prohibited by Islam. And even such forms as might be tolerated are only tolerated. They have nothing to do with religious practice whatsoever.
So we're in the West. Can you talk about how democratic principles peacefully coexist with a secular government?
Well, for those Muslims who live in the United States, or for any follower of any religion who lives in the United States, I think the answer is pretty obvious. In America, the concept of a secular government means a government which is neutral with regard to religion, that neither prohibits the practice of religion nor establishes the practice of any particular religion. A society like that is one in which religious people can function quite successfully, in which I think it is actually easier to practice one's religion than in a society where either it is repressed or suppressed, or on the other hand, where some state interpretation is imposed on people, even though that interpretation may go against their conscience. I think it's no surprise that America, of the developed countries, is the one that is considered most religious, whether measured by how often people pray, by whether they believe in God, whether they believe in heaven, whether they guide their lives by their religion, how many times they go to church or mosque or synagogue. On every one of these metrics, America is the most religious society. And I think it's because that notion of secularism allows religion to flourish. The notions of secularism that exist in other Western countries like France, I think that they're very wrong-headed notions, that they are not so much an idea of neutrality of government, so much as the attempt to prevent religion from being visible in the public square. But that is certainly a repression of any religion which, like Islam, attempts to offer moral guidance for how people are to behave, whether in private or in public.
Exactly, and goes against your definition of secular government as well.
Yes.
So Dr. Ahmad, you've written the only defining document of Islam is the Quran, the revelation to mankind through the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Hadith, traditions originating from the Prophet and his companions are defining but explanatory. Why is this statement relevant to you?
Well, the idea is this, that what constitutes Islam is articulated clearly in the Quran, which defines itself as a book of guidance. So it is guiding people to what is the right path in life and to success in this life and in the hereafter. Now, the supplementary texts for Islamic teachings are the Hadith, or the traditions of the practice of the Prophet. But these are not defining of the religion. These are how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, implemented the principles of the Quran in his society, in his era, in his age. We can look to them as illustrative examples that can help us to understand the principles. But when we instead blindly imitate what he did, even though we're in a different place and a different time, then we run the risk of, at best, irrelevance, and at worst, actually contradicting the principles. I like to give the following example. The Quran encourages us to respect the Prophet Muhammad's practices and offers them as an example to us. But I've always felt that some people don't know what the word example means. It is as if you had a book on arithmetic, and in the chapter on addition, it clearly explains the principles of how to add two numbers. And then at the end, it gives you an example, and it says 8 plus 6 is 14. Now, can you imagine a student who on the final exam is asked, what is 12 plus 7, and says 14? Of course, he's going to flunk. And when he protests to the teacher, but I'm only following the example in the book, it will get him nothing. So what we have to understand is we need to look at the practice of the Prophet in context and understand why he did what he did as an application of those principles. Then, hopefully, we'll understand the principles well enough that we can apply them in our era and in our environment, our locality, so that we can come up with as good a solution for our current day problems, which were not exactly the problems he faced.
Exactly. My father always says to read the book in the era that it was written. So you also made the distinction of or relationship between universal principles, blind imitation of past events. You spoke about that a little bit in your previous answer, an application of knowledge in the modern world. Can you go on a little bit more about that?
Yes. Well, I think this is, to go a little more deeply in what I brought up in the previous example. There are certain principles that are universal, by which I mean that they will apply in any time and place. And when you look at the Quran, I think that overwhelmingly that is what it's talking about. It's trying to present these principles. It draws not only on the Prophet's own time, but on historical events, far, outside of his time, even on what appear to be parables and mythological events, in order to try to make the principles clear. Now, again, if someone simply blindly imitates what the Prophet did, they are certainly not understanding the principles, and they may be violating it. There was an imam, a brilliant scholar, who was the imam of the Muslim Community Center out here in Silver Spring for a while. His name was Abdurrahman Osman. And he once gave a khutbah, a sermon, in which he explained the difference between emulation and blind imitation. Which in Arabic they're called qadwa and taqlid. And he was advocating qadwa and he was opposing taqlid. And he said, if you see someone carrying an umbrella on a rainy day, and you understand that he's protecting himself from the rain, and you do the same thing, then you are engaged in qadwa, or emulation. If you see a man carrying an umbrella on a sunny day, and you understand that he's doing this to protect himself from the heat of the sun, and you do the same thing, then this is qadwa, or emulation. But if you see a man carrying an umbrella on an overcast day, you have no idea why he's doing it, and you do the same thing, this is taqlid, it's blind imitation, and it's not a good thing.
Exactly. What is the definition of Sharia?
Well, Sharia is a word that has come to be used as a synonym for Islamic law. But actually, the word itself literally means the path to the water. And it certainly can be puzzling to people why a word that literally means the path to the water could become a synonym for Islamic law. And so I encourage people to reflect on the implications of this usage. In the context in which the Quran was revealed, of course, it was a desert. And there was nothing more important to know than the path to the water. Your life depended upon it. So in Islamic terminology, in Quranic terminology, the path that the Quran is guiding us to is like the path to the water. It's that essential. But like a path to the water, the Sharia, the right path of human action, is something that is God-given. And it's something that we have to understand through the application of our intelligence and our mind. In other words, we have to take that natural, existing, God-given path, we have to discover what that path is through an intellectual activity. That intellectual activity is the jurisprudence that the scholars engage in when they attempt to articulate the Islamic law. And that jurisprudence, which in Arabic is called fiqh, has sometimes been confused for the Sharia. People will often talk about, use the word Sharia, and then they'll talk about the fiqh. But this is confusing the reality for a map of the reality. Just like a physical scientist takes nature as God-given, but attempts to map it through the creation of theories. For example, take the law of gravity. Gravity was created by God. It is what it is, and we human beings try to understand it. Aristotle thought gravity was the tendency of everything to naturally be at the center of the universe. Centuries later, Isaac Newton said gravity was a mutually attractive force between any two bodies. Now, we tend to accept Einstein's theory that gravity is just the curvature of space, not a force at all, certainly not a tendency to be at some mythical center of the universe. What's happened is our understanding of gravity has changed in revolutionary and profound ways, and yet gravity never changed. It is now, always will be, and always was what God made it to be. In the same way, the Sharia is that divine path to success. And the attempt of the scholars to understand that path when they enunciate the rules of Islam, saying this is mandatory, this is forbidden, this is optional, this is encouraged, this is discouraged, that is a human attempt to map that path and should never be mistaken for the path. So I always get annoyed when someone asks the question, do you believe in imposing Sharia? To me, this is like asking, do you believe in imposing gravity? No, I don't believe in imposing gravity. Gravity is there, and we're going to obey it whether we like it or not. What I advocate is understanding gravity so that we may not fall over a cliff, but instead be able to do the wonderful things we're able to do with science. In the same way, I don't want to impose Sharia. I want to obey Sharia so that I will be able to succeed in this life and the next, as the Quran promises.
And so, Dr. Ahmed, if there is a confusion between the Ummah, if there's a confusion between fiqh and Sharia within the Ummah, how can we not expect that same confusion to translate into the greater American Ummah, the greater American community?
Yeah, we really do have to expect it. I'm not denying the existence of Islamophobia or the existence of people who try to demonize Islam or misrepresent Islam. But the fact is that the lion's share of the blame for this confusion lies on the Ummah for not being in touch with its own religious teachings and history. And I think we have a serious educational problem in the Ummah. Muslims have to, like the early generations of Muslims, make themselves into scholars to try to understand the religion and not feel that it's just a tradition that you grew up with, and so everything you do must necessarily be correct.
Exactly. So can you explain the relationship between Sharia and the rule of law as it relates to Muslims?
Well, for me, the idea of Sharia is very much like the idealized notion of the rule of law. As I said, it's not fiqh, which is a detailed jurisprudence with its history and its cultural variations and different schools of thought. It's an abstraction. But it's a very important abstraction. The very knowledge that there is such a thing as a law that should be obeyed, that serves the purpose of harmonizing the disparate interests of the different people in a society so that all of our actions can aim towards a common good, not by sacrificing our own interests, but serving our own interests even as we serve those of others, is a very essential concept. And it is that highest notion of the rule of law. And in between this high abstraction the Sharia represents and the day-to-day decisions of the fiqh as to what is permissible and what is not, are what are called the maqasid of Sharia, or the higher objectives of the Sharia. If the Sharia as a whole is aimed at universal justice, then there are certain values that are enshrined in the Sharia that are the purposes of the law. And in Islamic history, the traditional scholars have identified 5 of these, which in modern language can be stated as 5 human rights. The right to life, the right to the intellect, the right to religion, the right to family or lineage, and the right to dignity. And it is this concept of the higher objectives of the Sharia that I think make the meeting point at which we can understand what are Islamic values and where we can start comparing them to the values of other social systems.
And so can you explain your understanding between Sharia and natural law within Islam?
Yes. I think that there's a very direct connection, in part, like I was just talking about, when you look at the maqasid of Sharia, when you look at the objectives of the law, you see an articulation of values that are also articulated in natural law theory. When you read John Locke, for example, he talks about life, liberty, and property. Well, the right to life is one of the maqasid of Sharia. The right to property is one of the maqasid. And the right to liberty, while not enunciated in that language, if you look at all of the the cluster of rights that are talked about in Islamic laws, the objectives of the Sharia, they overlap pretty heavily, I think, with Locke's notion of liberty. And it's interesting to me that there's some historical evidence that Locke got these ideas from Islamic civilization. In the early part of his career as a philosopher, Locke was a pragmatist, not a natural law advocate. He changed his mind in 1671, and according to his diary, he changed his mind after attending a party given by a professor at the university in London. Scholars, historians investigating this are convinced that the professor in question was Edwin Pocock, who in that year was about to publish his translation into Latin of Hayy ibn Yaqzun, the great work of Ibn Tufayl, Alive the Son of Awake. Pocock translated it into the Philosophicus Autodidactus, the self-taught philosopher. This story of Ibn Tufayl's about a creature with perfect reasoning ability who's spontaneously generated on an island by himself, eventually comes into contact with human beings, comes and studies human society, and advances his already enormous knowledge of the natural world with a knowledge of the social sciences by watching human beings, comes to the conclusion that that religion serves the purpose of that harmonization I mentioned before between the individual interests and the collective interests, and makes it possible for people to succeed in this life by not only confirming the great truths that the great minds of the philosophical tradition have arrived at, but by painting them in a language of preaching that even people who are not intellectuals can understand, so that all human beings, whether they're highly intellectual or not, can understand the importance of obeying the law, of the rule of law, and that these natural rights are, in the nature of human beings, the way God created us. Having learned of that connection between Locke and the Muslims, and also Locke, when he was in exile from Britain, was sheltered by Quakers who had copies of the Quran as well as Sufi writings in their libraries, that suddenly makes intelligible to me why, when I read Locke, the language sounds so Islamic, talking about God-given rights, because that is not something that you see heavily emphasized before Locke, and that's something that after the Enlightenment you begin to see de-emphasized in Western thinking. And
you spoke about that type of influence within Western thinking. Is that just a constant within the United States? And why, it's not it's not a relationship within Europe, within that part of Western society?
You see it in Europe as well. Obviously, Locke wrote in Britain, and his ideas impacted the Glorious Revolution and the repeal of the Corn Laws and all these other things. But the fact is that I think you see these ideas better implemented in American society than you do in European society, and for various reasons, not least of which is the fact, this notion of secularity I talked about before, that in America, because you were never required to suppress your religion, religious ideas infuse the development of the political society. I don't think you can see any clearer example of that than in America's wrestling with the issue of race. America was plagued with not just slavery, but it was slavery based on race, on an idea that one group of people deserved to be slaves and others did not. And who were the people who fought hardest against this? It was the Pietist Protestants. They fought against it because they were motivated not for material considerations, although obviously the capitalist society was against it because they wanted mobile labor, but the individuals who fought hardest were those who were motivated by spiritual concerns, that only if a person was free to choose their religion could they choose Christianity and to be spiritually liberated. They were concerned about spiritual liberation first and about material issues secondarily. This is something that gets ignored in the history books. But even in the 20th century, the civil rights movement, main leader of the civil rights movement in the United States was Dr. Martin Luther King, but he was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was motivated by his deep religious feelings that gave him not only the goal of a colorblind society, but the means by which he could fight for that goal and fight with considerable success. The same thing I think is true really everywhere in the world. We like to point out to all the so-called religious conflicts, and people, what I call the radical secularists, the secular fundamentalists, like to claim that those conflicts are due to religious disagreements. But I've never found that be the case. What I found almost invariably when you see these fights, they're not fighting over differences in religious teachings, they're fighting over differences in religious identity. My group, my religious group, should be privileged over your religious group, or vice versa. And that, to the contrary, the most religious people, the ones who are most sincere in their fear of God, if you will, tend to be the ones who are willing to stick their necks out in order to fight for justice and to fight against the oppression involved in the land disputes that are almost invariably behind these struggles.
You've written that according to the Holy Quran that it's clear that life is a fundamental value. How does the Quran support your assertion?
Well, the problem to answer that question is where to start. There are so many places where this point is made. Perhaps one of the most striking places, most clear and ambiguous, is where it says that if you kill a single person unjustly, it's as if you have killed an entire people. And if you save the life of a single person, it is as if you had saved the lives of an entire people. Yes. Now, this is, you can explain this by saying it's referring to the fact that a human being who dies can't have offspring, and so you're literally killing off an entire people. Or you can take it as a rhetorical point to say that life is really important and really fundamental. Exactly. And that's the way I take it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmad. Dr. Ahmad, thank you so much. We have about 2 minutes left in the program. So I wanted to ask you about the debate between what God has ordained for us and what we believe God has written within Quran. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I was at a conference recently, a scholarly conference, where we were discussing the two different views that you find among the Muslim scholars about whether does God command what is right because it is right, or is it right because God has commanded it? And I said, well, it is very interesting that when you look at how the Quran makes its point on, for example, the importance of human life that we were just talking about, that it's so fundamental. In the Quran, God bans female infanticide. But the language with which he bans it is interesting. He doesn't say, I'm God and I'm against female infanticide and therefore you're not going to do it, end of discussion. Instead, he says the following: fear that day when the female infant who was killed will be asked for what crime was she killed. This is an appeal to a moral sentiment. It is a reflection of what the Quran says elsewhere very clearly. It says that God has given us a self, and that this self and its proportion, its ability to know right from wrong, when it's uncorrupted, is one of the signs of God. And that if we will purify this self, then we will see the difference between right and wrong. But when we corrupt it, then we begin to think right is wrong and wrong is right. In the beautiful language of the Quran, it says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. He who purifies the self will succeed, and he who corrupts the self will fail.
We've been talking to author and Muslim intellectual Dr. Imad Ad-Din Ahmad about conflict within Islamic civilization, the challenge and disentangling of culture from religion. If you want to see this and many other programs, go to Read One channel on YouTube. If you wish to talk with us directly, email our producer at scholarschair@gmail.com. I'm Jamiah Adams. Good night.
Hit it, hit it, hit it.
Ha ha ha.